We've all experienced the feeling of holding ace-king in a tournament spot and being unsure what to do. Whether it's pre-flop facing a re-raise, or post-flop when you flop ace-high, it can be one of the most difficult hands to play in certain spots. If you struggle with these situations, this video is for you. Looking at an individual hand in isolation isn't how we would usually build our strategy, but with a hand like ace-king that often forms a fairly large part of our range in certain spots, it's quite important to take note of some of the key trends. So let's take a look. First, let's address some of the most common errors that players make with ace-king. Later on, we'll start differentiating between the offsuit and suited varieties, but for now, we'll just talk in very general terms about ace-king as a whole. One of the biggest weaknesses players will exhibit in tournament scenarios, particularly at low stakes in situations where players are stacking off with very tight ranges pre-flop, is simply being all in for far too many big blinds with ace-king. The main reason ace-king is so heavily inclined to be all in pre-flop in various spots, even for a lot of chips, is because it can win a flip against jacks or queens, and it blocks kings and aces, meaning it gets more folds when it shoves all in. But there's a big difference between shoving with fold equity and calling off your stack versus a shove, and it's surprisingly common to see players happily risking 100 big blinds or more with ace-king in spots where they're much more likely to run into aces or kings than queens or jacks. Secondly, many players are extremely reluctant to ever flat call a raise with ace-king preflop. This leak actually contributes to the first leak because it's often an unwillingness to simply flat call a 3-bet from a tight opponent that leads to players 4-betting and stacking off with ace-king in bad spots. After all, being all in is much easier because we never have to make any more decisions, while calling forces us into some awkward post-flop spots, and nobody likes awkward post-flop spots. Which brings us to our third leak that players exhibit with ace-king, which is simply to play far too passively when missing the flop post-flop, resulting in a lot of checking and hoping to win with the best ace-high. While there are a lot of spots where winning with the best ace-high is a reasonable expectation, there are also plenty of spots where ace-king actually needs to be willing to bluff post-flop at a high frequency, particularly in 3-bet pots where ace-king makes up a big chunk of our overall 3-bet range, and we will often need to reach for bluffs more ambitiously. So with all of this in mind, let's start with some of the basics of how we want to play our ace-king, beginning with simple raise first in spots. Take a look at this question coming up and see what you think the answer is. Obviously, at deeper stacks, we're not going to do any open shoving at all. But at which stack sizes will ace-king offsuit and ace-king suited begin open shoving in chip EV scenarios? The correct answer is actually the first one, 14 big blinds for ace-king off and 10 big blinds for ace-king suited. The main reason for this is simply that ace-king suited doesn't mind being forced to play post-flop at a low SPR when the big blind defends. It can flop a front door or back door flush draw much more easily than ace-king offsuit, and therefore it's happy to simply min-raise or even limp at 10 to 14 big blind stacks to induce action from players behind. Ace-king offsuit, however, realizes equity very poorly when going to the flop without being all in. So it has a much greater desire to simply open shove when we're in that awkward region between 10 and 14 big blinds. This graphic illustrates what ace-king offsuit wants to do in chip EV spots. As you can see, we're never open jamming once we hit the 17 big blinds and above range, but once we cross the 14 big blind threshold, we heavily prefer just being all in. In particular, shoving ace-king off here helps to strengthen our shoving range, which helps improve the EV of all the suited Broadway and weaker ace hands that we're also going to shove at these stack sizes. By contrast with ace-king suited, as you can see here, we're actually quite happy to limp with it once we get down to 14 or 12 big blinds, with it becoming almost a pure limp from later positions, and the open shove only really becoming an option once we hit 10 big blinds, and we start almost eliminating our limping strategy altogether. Next, let's tackle what we're doing with ace-king once we actually face a raise, beginning with the deeper stack sizes in the early stages of a tournament. These are the spots that many players get wrong, and you'll start to notice here that the differences between ace-king offsuit and ace-king suited become amplified by deeper stack sizes. This is our best example right here. On the left, you have ace-king off strategy for the first hand of a tournament at 200 big blinds, while on the right, you have ace-king suited. Ace-king off is mixing 3-bets and calls from most positions, only becoming a pure 3-bet in the cutoff versus button or small blind versus big blind formations, while ace-king suited is almost a pure 3-bet in almost every single formation. The only time we mix calls is when we're specifically in the big blind versus an early position raise, where we have a very low 3-bet frequency to begin with. This is a great way to highlight just how much better of a hand ace-king suited is than ace-king offsuit at deep stacks. It realizes equity much more effectively, especially in 3-bet pots versus dominated ranges, and we should certainly approach ace-king suited very differently than its offsuit counterpart as a result. This trend continues once we get down to 80 big blinds with 75% of the field remaining. While ace-king off is a little happier to 3-bet at higher frequencies here, suited is now a pure 3-bet in all spots. A rare example of a spot where a certain hand takes the same action no matter what position the raiser is coming from or what position we're in. If we go down to 50 big blinds with 50% of the field left, nothing changes for suited, but offsuit is now almost a pure 3-bet in almost all spots, with just a small amount of mixing occurring when we're in middle position or the big blind against an early position raise. The presence of some degree of ICM makes it more incentivized for us to 3-bet, since we'll be doing less flat calling overall, and the value of the times when our opponent folds to our 3-bet is slightly greater. At this point, we'll see a fairly consistent trend once we get shallower. All our ace-kings are just going to always 3-bet or shove over an open, depending on how deep we are, so there's not much point of going beyond the 30 big blind threshold as we approach the bubble here. The deeper stack sizes are the main ones to pay attention to here, since they're the spots where there's a big difference between how ace-king offsuit wants to play and how ace-king suited plays. You'll see this again when we look at how we respond to a 3-bet. Which brings us neatly to our next topic, which is exactly that: how we handle facing a 3-bet with ace-king. Let's start once again with deep stacks at the very beginning of a tournament, since that's where we'll see some very interesting trends. There are two very noteworthy things here. First of all, there are almost no spots where any version of ace-king is a pure 4-bet at deep stacks. And secondly, that there actually are some spots where ace-king off finds a fold to a 3-bet. These are coming exclusively when we open under the gun and get 3-bet by one of the blinds, mainly the big blind. The big blind's 3-bet range is so narrow at this depth and their 3-bet sizing is so large that ace-king off no longer functions especially well as a call. Ace-king suited, however, is very happy to continue through a call in a lot of spots. In fact, its overall calling frequency is higher than that of ace-king off, and it plays almost a pure call versus a 3-bet from the blinds when it has position post-flop. Another example of suited being happy to play post-flop in spots where offsuit is not, and an early indicator that folding offsuit pre-flop is a lot more reasonable in certain spots than folding suited. Now, I have another question for you as we begin to discuss medium stack sizes. Which of these strategies is generally preferable versus 3-bets at 50 to 80 big blind stacks in the middling phases of a tournament? Do we want to 4-bet small with ace-king off and flat with ace-king suited? Jam with ace-king off and 4-bet small with suited? Jam both offsuit and suited? Or 4-bet small with both offsuit and suited? Take a moment to think about your answer, and then let's go ahead. If you answered to jam ace-king offsuit and 4-bet small with ace-king suited, you'd be correct. It might be tempting to think we would flat ace-king suited since it plays so much better post-flop, but in fact that's the reason why we 4-bet small with it. If our 4-bet does get flatted, we realize equity really well, even from out of position. Our next two graphics will showcase this phenomenon. At 80 big blinds here with 75% of the field remaining, you can see that ace-king off has a strong desire to be all-in versus a 3-bet in many spots, while ace-king suited never does. However, at this depth, there is still some flatting with both versions of the hand in certain formations to protect our flatting range a little. Once we get down to 50 big blinds though, ace-king offsuit almost never wants to flat, and tends to split between shoving and 4-betting small depending on the formation. Ace-king suited, however, almost never shoves, and much prefers to 4-bet small in most spots, with the slight exception of the spots where we open in early position and get 3-bet by the blinds. As we get shallower and progress through the tournament, things become very simple. Ace-king off will virtually always 4-bet jam at 30 big blinds, while ace-king suited will prefer to 4-bet small, or sometimes jam if the 3-bet specifically comes from the small blind. Even on the bubble, ace-king suited is still happy to essentially click it back and call it off, given that our opponent is supposed to jam some worse aces sometimes, while ace-king offsuit is still very afraid of getting flatted and just wants to jam pre-flop as usual. By the time we reach the final two tables and our stack is much shorter at 15 big blinds, we're now at the point where both ace-king offsuit and ace-king suited are just 4-bet jamming versus a 3-bet, because we have no more room to have a non-all-in 4-bet range. We can actually simplify this equation fairly easily. If we're deep stacked enough that we have some kind of a non-all-in 4-bet range, ace-king suited should usually be in that range alongside pocket aces. To some degree, this deters our opponent from flatting the 4-bet, since we will have a little bit more ability to realize equity post-flop. But it also helps to ensure that our opponent never has to think twice about getting it in with kings when we 4-bet. If our range is aces, ace-king suited and bluffs instead of just aces and bluffs, they know they can sometimes shove with kings and get called by worse. This might seem like a small factor, but it does matter. Next, let's take a quick look at another type of spot which does tend to trip people up, facing a 4-bet at deep stacks. If we're 200 bigs deep on the first hand of the tournament, one thing is evident right away. Ace-king off sometimes folds to a 4-bet in some of the tightest formations, while ace-king suited never does. That's a very important variable here and can serve as a useful heuristic whenever we're in difficult deep stack spots. In addition, ace-king suited is actually 5-betting less often than ace-king off, preferring to call at a higher frequency. Why could this be happening? Well, it's actually because while ace-king off is content with 5-betting as a bluff and then folding to a 6-bet jam sometimes, ace-king suited really hates getting 6-bet jammed on, so it would prefer to call the 4-bet and realize some equity. It helps us ensure our 4-bet range is protected against the 5-bet by having some calls in it, and if our opponent is 5-betting a lot of ace-king off, our ace-king suited will play very well post-flop on many boards. Once we get even a little further into the tournament though, we start to see some familiar trends. Ace-king off almost always wants to be all in against a 4-bet, while ace-king suited will tend to choose between jamming and calling depending on the formation. There is some non-all-in 5-betting, but it's only in the later position formations, and it's going to be a very low-frequency play since we really won't have a lot of room to 5-bet when we're only 80 big blinds deep. So that concludes our pre-flop discussion. We saw some very clear trends there. But what about post-flop? Well, our overall approach to playing ace-king post-flop can be summarized quite succinctly, but before I tell you exactly how we'll do that, take a look at this next graphic. I've looked at the 50 big blind single raise pot formations for under the gun, hijack, and button versus big blind on 10 different flops, all of which are queen high or lower since those are obviously the ones where ace-king doesn't make a pair. This table shows the overall betting frequency for our range next to the combined betting frequency for all our ace-king combos. Pause the video for a moment, take a look at the chart, and see if you can pinpoint any trends. I know there's a lot of info there, but hopefully you picked up on the same thing I did, that the frequency we bet with ace-king is very often closely correlated with the frequency we bet our entire range. There are a few exceptions, of course, but as a general rule of thumb, this is a really valuable insight. Naturally, if we're range betting a certain flop, we know we're going to be betting all of our ace-king because we're betting everything. But if we're not range betting, it seems like our strategy with ace-king is being guided by our overall range. In fact, not only is this true, but the inverse is also true to some degree. Because ace-king is one of the hands which we're always going to open raise pre-flop in both the suited and offsuit varieties, and there are 16 combos of it, ace-king along with ace-queen and quite often ace-jack and king-queen is actually the most common hand in our range as the pre-flop raiser. As a result, it exerts quite a big influence on our overall strategy. Much more so than something like 8-7 suited, where there are only 4 combos and we're not always opening the hand from every position at every stack depth. The best examples of this phenomenon are the Jack-9-7 all clubs flop, where there's a very strong level of consistency between how often our range bets and how often ace-king bets, and the 5-4-3 two-tone flop, where you can see a similar thing happening. Obviously, the exact properties of the board are going to influence these trends. You can see that there's a bigger discrepancy here on paired boards, because on those boards, ace-king high will essentially be a straight-up value bet. There are also going to be some variations between ace-king offsuit and ace-king suited, which you can't see in this graphic, and that's going to be a product of suit interactions, because any version of ace-king that has a front door or back door flush draw is usually going to be a lot more happy to bet on any given board. If we switch over and look at the same chart for when we're the outer position pre-flop raiser up against the button, this time from the under the gun, low jack, and cutoff positions, we can see some similar things happening. The boards where we're betting very rarely are mostly boards where ace-king naturally plays a very high-frequency check, while the boards where ace-king is fairly strong, like 9-9-5 rainbow or queen-jack-9 with a flush draw, are also boards which we're fairly happy to bet at a high frequency with our overall range, and therefore with ace-king itself as well. In fact, this trend is perhaps even more evident from out of position than it is from in position. The clustering of frequencies between the different board textures is much tighter, and there are only a couple of scenarios where ace-king plays more aggressively than our overall range does on any given board. So to summarize our overall post-flop approach with ace-king, here are our 3 main points. Firstly, we're generally going to play our ace-king the same way we would play our overall range. If we're range betting, obviously we're betting our ace-king because we're betting everything. If we're betting at a low frequency, the same goes for ace-king. This is very relevant from out of position, where certain boards will force us to essentially range check, and therefore necessitate always checking ace-king as well. Secondly, we should pay close attention to suit interactions with all of our ace-king combos. Ace-king off can flop the nut backdoor on a two-tone flop, or some pretty good blockers on various other flops, while ace-king suited will flop a lot of front door and backdoor nut flush draws. All these factors are going to slightly influence our overall aggression level, and may lead us to play certain combos of ace-king slightly more aggressively than others. Finally, we should be very mindful of whether we're betting ace-king for value or as a bluff. Sometimes we're going to bet it on high card boards to fold out low pairs, which can be particularly relevant in 3-bet pots, while at other times, we'll bet the nut ace high to get called by worse ace highs and backdoors which we dominate, such as on paired boards in wide range formations. That's about it for this video. Hopefully you feel a lot more confident with your ace king now. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you soon in the next video.